Welcome, everyone, and thank you for attending the latest in a series of public events in 2021 by the Michael V. Hayden Center for Intelligence, Policy, and International Security. I am Mark Rozelle. I serve as Dean of the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University, and we are proud to host the Hayden Center. The academic calendar year may be winding down, but the Hayden Center is stepping it up with more events, including another next week that we will discuss later on. But for tonight, we have about 325 persons signed up from all over the United States and internationally for this seminar. Participants specifically are from 32 states and the District of Columbia, as well as from Canada, Mexico, the United Kingdom, Spain, Portugal, Italy, and South Korea. The Hayden Center is part of a larger security studies emphasis in the Schar School of Policy and Government. We have as well the Center for Security Policy Studies, directed by Professor Ellen Leibson, who also directs our International Security Studies Master's Degree Program. And that has been a top 10 program nationally for 4 years running in the US News and World Report rankings. And we are fortunate to have many leading scholars and practitioner teachers in our International Security Studies Master's Degree Program. Related to that is our unique program in biodefense studies, and given its emphasis on infectious diseases and public policies to combat those, you can imagine that interest in that program has grown substantially. And additionally, we have a generous gift from the Diana Davis Spencer Foundation supporting scholarships for Schar School students in security studies fields, such as the two programs that I just mentioned. And the Hayden Center, of course, honors its founder, General Michael V. Hayden, who has been on our faculty now for 11 years. General Michael Hayden is here to offer welcome remarks, after which Executive Director of the Hayden Center, Larry Pfeiffer, will introduce our program. But first, I'm honored to introduce or welcome General Michael Hayden. General.
Thank you. Thank you again. I'm looking forward to this. I really am. There's a lot going on, and frankly, I'm not too sure what I believe what's going on in China. So I'm looking forward to this briefing. Really good. I'm really good at it. So Larry, you have it. Thank you again.
Thanks, General Hayden. If there's one thing I've heard General Hayden say over the last 4 or 5 years, it's that we've got a lot of challenges in our national security, but the challenge that if we don't get it right is going to define who we are as a nation and where we stand as a nation in the broader League of Nations. It is China. We got to get it right. Tonight, we're going to hear a lot of great conversation from our two intelligence experts. These guys have been, together a combined total of 60 some years worth of work on China. And I think you're going to get the straight scoop from them on what the heck is really going on over there. Real quickly, for those who aren't familiar with us, the Hayden Center has been at the Schar School of Policy and Government for the last 3.5, almost 4 years. We stood the center up as an attempt to try to demystify intelligence for the general public, for our students, our faculty, our staff. We do that largely through events. They used to be in person. We're going to be back in person starting in the fall. We've been doing virtual events this last year, and we use these events to try to better inform the public on how intelligence supports national security and the policymaker community. Our events are on Zoom as we're doing here today, but we also record them. We put them on our YouTube channel. So if you want to see some of the other events we've done over the last few years, just go to YouTube, search on Hayden Center, and you'll find them all right there. We're very active on social media, particularly Twitter, where we try to put out information about the Schar School, about the Hayden Center, things General Hayden is up to, but also we like to highlight items of interest that are out there on intelligence to, again, help better inform. We also are active on Facebook and LinkedIn, so check it out. As Mark suggested, we got a great event happening next week on Wednesday. Michael Morell will be back with us to sit down with some intelligence community legends to discuss the future of intelligence. We really are at an interesting inflection point on how intelligence is actually done. So he'll be sitting down with John Brennan, former director of CIA, Sue Gordon, former principal deputy director of national intelligence, Robert Cardillo, former director of the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, amongst other jobs they all had. So check out our Twitter feed, our Facebook, our LinkedIn. You can find information about how to register for that. I'll after others get talking, I'll just poke it into the chat box if you want to see the link there. Our questions will be starting at about 10 minutes of the hour. So please start thinking of questions about China that you'd like answered by our great guests here. You can put the questions in the Q&A box, not the chat box, the Q&A box. That's where we're going to be looking for your questions. When the time comes, Michael will start pulling from those questions and direct them to our guests here. By way of introduction, we've got some fantastic guests here. We have Chris Johnson. He's a senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He spent over 2 decades as an analyst at CIA. He also served as an intelligence liaison at the State Department, serving 2 Secretary of States and their deputies. He's even served abroad in Southeast Asia. He is in high demand today as a commentator and expert on issues involving China and the rest of Asia. You'll also find him articles that he's written as well out there. So please take a look at that. John Culver, he retired from CIA last April after serving for 35 years as an analyst in East Asian affairs, considered one of the top experts on China, one of the top experts on Chinese military and defense and security issues. One of his last jobs was serving as the National Intelligence Officer for East Asia for the intelligence community from 2015 to 2018. John's also in great demand. He offers comments on issues on China and East Asia in many publications, and we're really grateful that both of you gentlemen have agreed to join us tonight. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Michael Morell so we can get into it. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Larry. It is great to be with everybody. I'll tell you that CIA has produced hundreds of China analysts, China experts over the years. I was lucky enough to work on East Asia for first half of my career, so I saw many of them. And I will tell you that John Culver and Chris Johnson are among the best ever produced by the agency. So we are extraordinarily lucky tonight to have both of them together. And Chris and John, I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Same here.
Let me start. I told each of you that I was going to break this into 3 buckets. The first bucket is sort of how to think about China today, and a whole bunch of issues around that, and how to think about U.S. policy. The second bucket is how to think about U.S. policy, and a whole bunch of issues around that. And then the third is, where are we going, and where might we end up, and how should different groups of actors in the world think about that and behave as a result. So that's kind of the roadmap. And so let's start by getting each of you to talk about the challenge or threat that you see China posing to the United States. How do you define that, right? And how do you kind of put that into words that somebody in the middle of the country who doesn't follow this on a day-to-day basis, right? How would you help them understand the threat or challenge posed by China? Chris, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Thanks, Michael. Great to be here, and great to see General Hayden and everyone else. Yeah, I mean, I think my sense is to start with what it's not. And what it's not is the Soviet Union, for all the reasons that we've seen. You know, it's far too easy these days to speak of the US being in a new Cold War with China. To some degree, we're certainly in a competition, and as President Biden suggested, an extreme competition with China. I think that's definitely a fair characterization. But so many of the features that defined the Cold War with the Soviets, such as Soviet isolation internationally, the sort of full-on competition, if you will, between the US and the Soviet Union across all domains, the complete lack of an economic relationship between the two countries. None of that exists with China. In fact, most of it is quite the opposite. So the bumper sticker for those folks in the middle of the country for me would be, you know, we're up against a challenge that we've not experienced before. We've got a country that is still growing at a very nice clip in terms of its economy. As we saw the other day, they face a series of challenges. We've always known about things like environmental degradation and things like that. But we saw that the population is now running into some serious troubles in China in terms of population growth. And that has been what has sustained that economic juggernaut, if you will, for the last 40 years. And that's now changing. So they have a lot of challenges that they're facing as well. I think we're finding a situation where in the person of Xi Jinping, the current president of China, we're facing a very determined competitor, somebody who believes in sort of a brass knuckles political style, both internally in his own country and increasingly abroad, as we've seen with tougher diplomacy from the Chinese and a lot of behavior in Hong Kong and in other places in China that are of concern to us from a human rights point of view. And we're facing a group of folks who believe that now is China's time to reemerge. They would say resurge, not rise, on the global and international stage. And they see the United States to some degree as potentially getting in the way of that. And they're determined to work around that. I think they also fundamentally, and this is, I'm sure we'll get into all these issues, but when we look at just one thing as an example, technology and the competition between our two sides on technology, I think the Chinese feel that because of the horrible reign of Mao Zedong and the Cultural Revolution and all the chaos that followed and so on, they kind of missed the revolutions, if you will, economically in the 20th century, right? Obviously, IT revolution and other things where the U.S. was able to, engineer huge economic development and growth. They're determined not to miss this one, the artificial intelligence, quantum computing, 21st century knowledge economy. And as such, we see them deploying a lot of resources at that and an unquenchable desire to win. So that's the challenge from my perspective.
John?
Yeah, just to build off what Chris said, I mean, partly it's just scale, 1.41 billion people in their new census with an aging population and really markedly slower population growth. By most measures, in purchasing power terms, they passed the United States in total economic size of GDP back in 2012. So in nominal terms, where you're just using the exchange rate, they're at about 70% of us. And then I'll touch on something Chris didn't mention is the Chinese military. I know, Michael, from when you and General Hayden were senior officials in the intelligence community, you know what we were saying about what the PLA would be in 2020. Well, they're right on schedule. I mean, none of this is a surprise. This isn't a, shock, sudden phenomenon of military modernization. It started out very persistently, kind of analogous to what Chris was saying about technology, moving up the modernization chain. And now they're really arriving. They're launching phenomenal numbers of new warships every year. They've eclipsed US Pacific Fleet in both numbers of most kinds of vessels except aircraft carriers, but especially in modernity. So a lot of the things US Navy sort of didn't do, like buy highly advanced supersonic anti-ship cruise missiles, the Chinese made major investments in. So, it used to be, as we saw in the mid-90s, if there was a problem, say, on the Taiwan Strait, we had a win button. We could send in the aircraft carriers. And the Chinese military had no response to that. In fact, their ability to track our carriers was so nil that we told Secretary of Defense Perry in 1996 that he would have to go on TV and announce it so they would understand the US action. We no longer have a win button. The Chinese have a lot of capability to challenge America's ability to get into a fight anywhere in China's near abroad. And, the decision then for a US president is not what Bill Clinton faced in 1996. It's going to be a question about severe losses, damage to US bases, attacks on our allies. And so the entire calculus has shifted because the Chinese, went through a major transition really right after the global financial crisis, where they no longer talked or thought about themselves internally as, a developing country and a rising power. They started thinking of themselves as a great power. And this was a major shift from the thinking that we saw in Beijing just a few years before, where they assumed that the US, after the end of the Cold War, would remain a globally dominant, and to use their terminology, unipolar hegemon for most of the 21st century. They now assess that because of the US wars in the Middle East, Afghanistan, the global financial crisis, the rise of populism in the Western democracies, and the rise of authoritarianism globally, and now the pandemic and kind of relative performance in the early phases of how it was handled in China versus the US, or even in Asia versus the West, that they now think that the US is in permanent decline. And they've come to two big conclusions from that assessment. One is, it's kind of a good news, bad news joke. On the one hand, China is rising faster than they assumed in relative terms because of US strategic blunders. On the other hand, they view us with a very paranoid lens. When US planes accidentally bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade in 1999, the Chinese thought it was intentional, that it was not an accident. And most Chinese leaders still believe that. So they have this very hostile view of the United States, bent on destroying and overthrowing the Communist Party of China. And they think that now that the US has recognized China as a strategic rival as of late 2017 with the last administration's national security strategy, that the US will become an even more aggressive hegemon, and that we'll have less restraint on our use of all means of our national power to counter them if we can.
And so let me just push you guys a little bit more on this question of threat challenge. So China's intense focus on those high technology industries that Chris talked about, and China's aggressiveness in the world in search of influence, right? Is that necessarily a bad thing for the United States? Is it a no-brainer bad thing? Are we making it bigger than it is? Talk about that a little bit. And maybe, John, start with you this time.
I think it's a new thing. It's a situation we never faced in the Cold War. I mean, even at its height, Soviet GDP never surpassed about 34% of ours. As I said, for a lot of practical terms, China's a peer as an economic power, and especially because of their dominance in manufacturing. And then they're rising, as Chris noted, efforts to be dominant even more in these new emerging technologies, ranging across everything from electronics to biotechnology to green energy. They're a peer challenge with scale and continental size, and then a certain amount of sway. Now, the other thing I don't want to lose sight of, to some extent, I think one of the real weaknesses of China today is, for the first time since Mao Zedong, they kind of believe their own bullshit. They've had this positive feedback loop on strategic projections they made 30 years ago that validate this kind of Marxist outlook. And you can see that in the so-called wolf warrior diplomacy and some of the really assertive and aggressive statements by Xi Jinping that, and he's been very blunt in his last talks about relative US and Chinese power, that we have to accept them as an equal. And that's really new. We may think that was in their heart of hearts even 10 years ago, but it's really only been in the last 5 years, and in some ways only the last couple of years, that they feel like that this great power rivalry is now well underway. And the thing is, again, the downside for them is this arrogance we're seeing. People sometimes talk about whether China is trying to export its system abroad to other countries, but I know of no country that finds it attractive, even if they admire some of the accomplishments the Chinese have made in terms of economic growth and their claims about eliminating severe poverty. The problem with the Chinese system, their economic system, their political system, their technological system, their financial system, is none of them are exportable. And it comes with a lot of sort of unattractive, attributes. Technologically enabled suppression might be attractive to authoritarians. No doubt it is. But that's hard to export unless you can really import really unexportable characteristics of the Chinese system.
Chris?
Yeah, I largely agree with what John said. I personally, I don't see it as a no-brainer bad for the United States. I think it's definitely, as John said, a challenge that we've never faced before. But we've been pretty good over our history of at rising to challenges that we never faced before. So I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I think there is about a bit of a freak out over it, which I'll come back to in a minute. I think where it is perhaps a definite no-brainer bad for us is that a really disturbing thing we're seeing, and it kind of speaks to John's point about the sort of arrogance, if you will, of what we're seeing coming out of China with, drunk with success, if you will, is that even the few areas, and they're increasingly countable on one hand, where most people generally agree that the US and China should be working together. So the things you usually hear are climate, after the last year and a half, pandemic disease, maybe North Korea, that's always a complicated one, perhaps Iran, proliferation challenges writ large, let's call it. Global financial stability, that's something we did very well together after the global financial crisis in 2008 and basically saved the rest of the globe. Even in those areas where it just makes sense for us to be working together, because of this increasing competition, they're becoming conflictual, right? So we have had, instead of coordination and cooperation on COVID-19, we've had vaccine wars, right? With the Chinese denouncing Western vaccines and the US denouncing theirs. The whole silliness over origin in terms of Wuhan versus Fort Detrick versus, so these areas where we should, hopefully be working together, we're not. So that's one area where I think it is really bad across the board. If we can't find anything on which to cooperate, that's a real challenge for us going forward, because guess what? We're both going to be in an increasingly small world neighborhood. I think on the sort of side of let's not lose our heads with this, however, I think one of the challenges is, frankly, as Americans, we've gotten a bit lazy. We haven't had what we might call an ideational challenger since the Soviets, right? So we've had a good 30 years with nobody out there with an alternative vision of world order, for example. So we kind of got used to everybody buying into the so-called US-led rules-based international order. That, interestingly, if you look into that phrase itself, it hasn't been around as long as most people think, only about 10 years. And so we see this pressure, coming from China in a different worldview, and it's causing us to have a bit of a freak out. So I think that's one problem. Two, as John was saying, yes, China has made a lot of impressive gains, but there aren't a lot of subscribers, to following the model too closely. So I get annoyed when our policymakers sort of say, they're out to destroy freedom and so on. My view is often when you look at these comments by their so-called wolf warrior diplomats and so on, it's so silly that certainly any Western countries, it's not going to prove attractive. So I don't think we need to be quite as wound up about this challenge as we are, and that extends to influence operations in the US and other Western countries. It's an important issue, but I think it's grossly overplayed. And, as John was saying, the US has been validating a lot of China's sort of dialectical conclusions in terms of a few series of failures that we've had. I think sometimes it's good for us to sit back and let them validate our conclusions about the weaknesses in their system on a more regular basis, rather than feeling we have to push back on every single thing they're doing.
Yeah. Chris, let me follow up by asking you, is Chinese policy coming from one man, Xi Jinping, or is it coming from a much broader consensus of the leadership?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of both. I mean, I think, as John was saying, you can find the roots of everything they're doing now in the previous leaders period, Hu Jintao. We saw certainly the increasing domestic tightening that we see under Xi Jinping accelerated, but it was definitely happening then. Certainly the sort of unfair subsidization of state industries and all of the problems that President Trump and Ambassador Lighthizer tried to address in the trade discussions with China, those are longstanding issues. So to some degree, none of this is really new. I think what we see is that in the same way that Donald Trump in the US was an accelerant for trends in the relationship that were leading toward a deterioration in the bilateral relationship, Xi Jinping's leadership has certainly been the same, from the Chinese side. So I think we would have gotten kind of where we are just maybe on a slower timeline than we have. On the issue of the internal consensus, I think that's a really important point, Michael. Unfortunately, on issues like the treatment of the Muslim Uyghur minority in Xinjiang in China, on how to handle Hong Kong, you're not going to find any people in the Politburo who think they should be changing tack on those issues. And this is really important for us to understand. I mean, just recently, within the last few months, there was this article written by an anonymous person, I believe it was called The Longer Telegram, that basically argued if we can just get rid of Xi Jinping, there's plenty of other guys who, while not necessarily members of the Glee Club, will be more willing to work with us. He's the problem. I don't think so. I think that all the membership of the Politburo, and frankly, a good chunk of the increasingly nationalist Chinese public, is drunk on the narrative that John highlighted.
Right. This meme that we heard last week or about 2 months ago, that the East is rising and the West is declining, is a very popular sentiment in China.
And then, John, let me ask you about Taiwan. There's been a lot of rhetoric about Taiwan on both sides, right? Discussions here about what our policy should be, discussions here about whether we should stick with the one China policy or not, discussions about how we should approach, how we talk about our willingness to defend Taiwan. And on the other side, right, we see Chinese rhetoric and we see Chinese military exercises. How do you think about Taiwan in the context of where we are?
I worry that it could become the most severe casualty, not like this year and maybe not even in the next 5 years, but I worry like after 2030, that it could become a real casualty as part of this great power rivalry, that it will become to be, especially by the United States, and it's not a partisan, conclusion, that there's utility in, staking out a stronger stance. I don't see the issue as very different from when you and all of us were back in the building across the river. That it's an old story and a well-played game that's gone through many phases. But the fundamental things that gave us stability over the last 40 years on the Taiwan Strait was a strong disinclination by any of the sides, and I'd count the US as one of them, to really rattle the cage of the status quo. That the ambiguous position we have on Taiwan was a condition of recognition of China in 1979. Successive Taiwanese governments may not like that, but they understand it and have found that the US can uphold its commitments under the 3 communiques on the Chinese side and also uphold the Taiwan Relations Act and President Reagan's 6 assurances to provide for Taiwan security. And what I'm worried about is that there are 3 kind of conditions that are weakening. And one is on Taiwan. At the time that the US and China signed the Shanghai Communique, I think in 1972 or 3, the US was able to acknowledge that the Chinese on both sides of the Taiwan Strait viewed that there was one China and that Taiwan was part of China. Flash forward, a few decades, the people on the other side of the Taiwan Strait no longer, by and large, considered themselves to be Chinese people. They considered themselves to be Taiwanese people. And so that kind of fundamental understanding that underpinned this complex policy has eroded. The other is that China is no longer a weak power that needed to prioritize as much strong economic growth as the basis for Communist Party legitimacy. They now consider themselves a great power. And in a way, it's taken away one of the excuses they used to have for not doing bad things to Taiwan, and that was weakness. I think right now the Chinese public and indeed the Chinese political apparatus no longer can claim as they were when we bombed when we accidentally bombed their embassy in Belgrade, or when there was a collision over the South China Sea in 2001, that China could not respond proportionally because it was too weak to challenge the United States. So if there's an incident, China would feel not only that it could respond, but that it must respond. And the third is this, as I keep mentioning, this US-China rivalry, that it's fueling a tendency on both sides to want to play that Taiwan card. And I think that would be disastrous for the people of Taiwan. And one of the things I try to keep in mind is when you see scary things the Chinese might be doing, is pay a lot of attention to the government of President Tsai on Taiwan. The Taiwan public is less terrified, it seems, when you look at polling, than Americans may be about Taiwan's safety. They have increased their military spending, but they're still only spending 1/25 of what China spends. They are not rapidly building the capacity for war because most Taiwanese, and I think the Taiwanese government, don't detect that there's a real risk of war. This is an issue to be managed, while on Taiwan, they pursue their attempts to continue to enhance the legitimacy of their democracy, rather than to overtly challenge Chinese sovereignty in a way that would compel the Chinese to use military force.
And then, John, if for some reason we slipped into conflict over Taiwan, whether it's China and Taiwan or the US chooses to enter, what does that look like militarily?
The largest conflict on the planet since World War II, to be blunt. That you're talking about the two most powerful militaries in the world, both of them nuclear armed, staging a very major armed confrontation. And we will feel, I think, compelled if we've made a decision, and your question kind of implied it, that we're going to do whatever it takes to come as rapidly as possible with maximum effort to defend Taiwan. Then you really incentivize the Chinese to use their full, anti-access area denial capabilities, ballistic and cruise missiles, pretty capable modern Air Force, advanced integrated air defense systems, to either deter that US intervention or possible defeat it. There's been a lot of good things written on this topic as it's kind of risen in kind of popular attention, including testimony that an old colleague of ours at DIA, Lonnie Henley, gave to the US-China Commission about 3 months ago, where he warned that if we become too focused on invasion, we're going to miss the fact that the Chinese don't need to invade Taiwan to wage a long-term successful military and political campaign for a permanent change in the status quo across the Taiwan Strait. And that in some ways, invasion of Taiwan is the preferred American option for the PLA to choose because it's the easiest to defeat. And that a more difficult course the Chinese could pursue for the US military to try to counter would be an open-ended blockade. To cut Taiwan off from energy supplies, selectively target leadership, military, and energy nodes on the island, make everything hot, dark, and quiet, and see, if attitudes change on the other side of the Taiwan Strait. And that's a very challenging situation for the US to try to fight its way, almost analogous to the later stages of the Islands Campaign in World War II, to fight our way across, at least between the third and second island chain, and then contest Taiwan in China's front yard.
Yeah,
go ahead, Chris.
I was just going to add a couple of quick points. One, I think John's really onto something with regard to the notion that the Chinese want to engage in a D-Day style invasion of Taiwan, I think is lunacy. They have such a broader array of capabilities, a suite of capabilities that they can employ over a long time horizon. I think that's the key thing in what John just said. They would envision this campaign unfolding certainly over months, maybe years, maybe a decade. And a key part of the goal, of course, is to wear down the will of the Taiwan people to resist and to wear down US and allied willingness to keep in the fight. I mean, they can, from their perspective, some years ago, they crafted this term, no contact warfare. They're very fond of it because it's very Sun Tzu, and so on. And they have a lot they can do that's really hard to answer. I think, John's done some writing on this. If you want to see a template, if you will, for how they might manage Taiwan, look at what they've done in the South China Sea, which is a series of different actions where they fundamentally change the facts on the ground, or in that case, on the water, without really firing a shot, and they've gotten away with it.
So maybe the last question in this China bucket, Chris, I want to come back to your comments about the challenges that China faces internally. So you mentioned demographics, you mentioned the environment,
Mhm.
I guess you could add the middle income trap
Definitely.
into that, right? You can probably add some other things into that. So
Mhm.
could you talk a little bit more about the challenges they face,
Mhm.
and do they recognize them as challenges, and
Right.
do they have approaches to dealing with them or not?
Yeah. Yes. Great questions. I think this is another reason why comparing them to the Soviet Union is a big mistake. My sense is, and I think it's generally accepted, that there were big areas, the minority regions of the Soviet Union, for example, et cetera, where the Soviet leadership just had no clue what was going on, and they turned to be very fatal issues for them. I think that my sense is the Politburo in China is very well aware of its issues. Their ability to execute on solutions is often limited by the fact that their ideology, their governance system, as John had highlighted, and so on, sometimes prevents them from being able, they might know this a solution, but it's not politically workable for them. I think when we look at things like Hong Kong or we look at Xinjiang, there are people obviously in the leadership who realize that this is damaging to certainly to China's global reputation, perhaps even to some aspects of China internally, but the system just can't do anything else because of its nature. So I think they face, a lot of those problems. I think if we wanted to wrap it all up, putting the environment aside, I think we see two main imperatives. We've just been talking about Taiwan. The leadership definitely sees that as existential, right? I mean, I think John and I fundamentally believe that the leadership, if they thought it was going the wrong direction, by which we mean independence for Taiwan, or arguably an abandonment by the United States of the one China policy. That's really what they're worried about, I think, of recent. That was certainly the case in the Trump administration. They would go to war for that. But they have a couple of other, I think, major imperatives, which in various forms, they've kind of told us what those are for them. The first is, as you highlighted, breaking through the middle income trap. They're well aware that they are the first non-market economy to be trying to successfully do that. And they're aware that that's not an easy task. They've signaled to us pretty clearly what their timeline is for that, 2035, where they want to become a middle income country, by that time. They have plans, including the most recently launched 14th five-year plan. They still do five-year plans. And this sort of longer term vision for 2035 gets a lot squishier once you get beyond the current five-year plan. And then I think the other one, which nobody really talks about in terms of imperatives or challenges, it's a lot squishier, maybe that's why people don't talk about it, is they're trying to create legitimacy abroad without democratization. And they're finding out it's really hard, that you can do as many Belt and Road projects as you want. You can send all the blue helmeted guys to conflict zones that you want. And it's really, really difficult to generate this international legitimacy. And I think we can argue that a lot of the aspects of their behavior seem counterintuitive to that. I just want to fold back because I think it is a very important point to make on something John said earlier. I'm a little more cynical, perhaps. I think there are a lot of countries in the world for whom maybe not the specifics of China's model, but the idea that I don't subscribe to your US-led rules-based international order. I think that actually is pretty powerful, for a lot of countries, and not just the various thuggeries across the globe. So I think that they are struggling with that issue of how do we do this, and I think they view both of those problems as every bit as existential to their survival as getting the Taiwan question right. And then I would just highlight one other thing because we didn't talk about it. Obviously, there is a huge risk for a major financial crisis in China. The debt pile grows by the day. Coronavirus was not helpful in that regard. Xi Jinping in 2017 announced the so-called three tough battles that they would focus on in this 5-year tenure of his term in office. And those three were poverty alleviation, box check. They declared victory on that last November. The environment, it's getting better. It has its challenges, but it's always getting better. And so-called guarding against financial risk. And there they don't think they've made enough progress. Witness the actions they're now taking against the internet giants, private sector internet giants in China, constant concerns from the regime about corruption in the financial sector, which involves leadership families and so on and so on. Xi has been very firm in saying we've got to get a hold of this problem. And I think his economic technocrats worry a little bit that that political imperative for him may cause them to overcorrect and actually precipitate the financial crisis they're worried about.
Yeah. And then, John, let me ask you one question. So this is the last question was not my last question in this section. This will be my last question. So the Chinese military, you can have the dust up with the Indians on the border, but it's been a long time since the Chinese military actually was in a significant conflict. Mm-hmm. And are there any doubts in China about the ability of the Chinese military to fight if it had to?
Yeah, sure. I mean, they haven't fought a major war since 1979, when they taught Vietnam a lesson in 3 weeks of combat, where I think the Vietnamese did most of the teaching. And they do, you know, you don't have to dig very deep to find people who would talk about the fear that, you know, they have peace disease, that they've gone so long without a war. But then, you know, this is what they'll say to reassure themselves. It's been a long time since the US Air Force and the US Navy and most of the US military has fought up here. So it's not like the US has more, you know, major naval battles under their belt in the last 40 years than the PLA does. So then it comes down to kind of how clearly they see the realities of 21st century warfare, in which case we are their great teacher, and they study everything we have done from Desert Storm to the present to learn both what to do and what not to do, and really more deeply to understand the nature of 21st century warfare in terms of intensity and the effects of precision and space surveillance, persistent surveillance, and increasingly unmanned and even autonomous systems. So they're very close students. And then it comes down to kind of modernity and training. And, you know, they also saw that their force structure was unsuited to this 21st century warfare. So in late 2015, early 2016, they launched the largest military reorganization in the history of the Chinese military. And it's comparable to the US kind of Goldwater Nichols. It's that dramatic, it's that extensive, it's that unwieldy, where for at least the first few years, they were probably breaking more than they were fixing as they moved entire units around and remade the entire structure of the senior command. And went from a general staff to a joint staff centered more tightly under the Central Military Commission under Xi Jinping. Well, they're coming out of the first, you know, 5 or 6 years of that, and you can see that they have largely succeeded. They're getting better at integrated joint operations. They do larger, in many cases, larger scale live training events than we do. So, you know, they still would never be confident until they've actually been in battle. And they still probably worry that even in a struggle against a lesser foe like India or Vietnam, who the Chinese would consider lesser than the United States, there's still a real capacity because of their inexperience that they could get humiliated. It might be a single incident where a major Chinese ship is sunk by an inferior foe, but, you know, for the Communist Party and for its armed wing, the People's Liberation Army, that would be a bad day.
I think too, because since we're about to move into U.S. policy, I just want to, I think it's important to highlight that reorganization from the perspective of understanding the person we're dealing with. So all of Xi Jinping's predecessors, including Deng Xiaoping, tried to engage in exactly the types of reforms that John highlighted, and they were not able to overcome the political resistance of the PLA. Xi Jinping managed to do it through what I call political shock and awe, which was a combination of anti-corruption at the highest campaign at the highest level of the military, cashiering very senior people, and this break a lot of dishes reorganization.
Okay, guys, I'm going to take you out of your comfort zone, right? Ask you to comment on U.S. policy, and maybe the way to do this is to think about it in terms of opportunity analysis, right? If you were talking to a U.S. policymaker and you were trying to give them, you know, ways to think about how they might be successful in dealing with China, what would you say? Who wants to go first?
I'm happy to start. You know,
For you to start.
Having been away now from the agency for a good while, I don't feel constrained anymore to talk about policy.
Excellent.
Look, my sense is it's kind of like, as John said on Taiwan, you know, sometimes what the Chinese, either militarily or otherwise, what they're not doing is as important as what they are doing. I think my comment to that U.S. policymaker or makers would be in that same lane. You know, I think what we have not seen, whether it was the George W. Bush administration, the Obama administration, the Trump administration, and thus far the Biden administration, is an effort before rolling out a series of policies on China, to kind of step back a little bit, do a fundamental racking and stacking of what we believe China's global ambitions are. I think that's a very important starting point. And, conduct that analysis as objectively as we can and kind of get a sense of, okay, what do these guys want? And then if you're able to do that, I think then you need to go down that list and say, okay, and which of these global ambitions are we able to accommodate? I think that's been the main failing of the last several administrations' China policy. We still believe that we can control the cadence of interaction, the way in which we work with the Chinese. We can set the timelines as to when we're going to engage and when we're not. And that's increasingly not true. And so I think there are going to be some areas where we will have to accommodate those ambitions. And for those areas where we can't, likewise, I think we need to communicate that to the Chinese leadership. And this needs to be done at a very senior level, privately, as the Chinese like to say, let's avoid microphone diplomacy. And for those areas where we don't think we can accommodate that ambition, we need to set out very clear red lines. And then we need to take actions where we enforce those red lines so they know that we're serious. So that would be my advice.
John, you want anything?
Yeah, I don't know if this makes me philosophic or cynical, but in a way, I think the U.S. is finally responding to the challenge the Chinese saw a decade ago. They started arraying for great power rivalry, and even try to talk to us about that to put some curbs on the risk of military conflict as early as 2013. So we're all kind of finally living in the same world where we acknowledge each other as strategic rivals. But the US kind of spent the last 4 years just arraying itself for that rivalry. It was really getting used to the idea that, the period where the US was the sole hegemon of the post-Cold War period was passing, and that the world was getting messier and more complicated. And, certainly a pandemic will bring that home in some ways. So I think we're kind of where we need to be. We haven't lost. I don't subscribe to the direst predictions, and I think that the Biden administration and, really building on some of the aspects of the Trump administration, because I see no radical sea change in China policy just because Joe Biden replaced Donald Trump as president. There's a lot more continuity, including the trade war, which continues. But I think we now need to move past that arraying for competition and actually, as Chris was saying, have a strategy. And I would add to his list of prescriptions, really identify what our vital national interests are, and then array strategy around defending those. And, you could probably steal a page from the Chinese, who do think, have not being burdened by pesky elections, they can think in decadal arcs, right? So think about the mid-century as the Chinese have for their, glorious ambitions, and think about what we think the world will look like because of factors like climate change or technological change, demographics, all of the factors that drive studies like the National Intelligence Council's global trends, and then really think about how we array ourselves in the context of that future world to defend our vital national interest, to ensure the prosperity and security of the American people. And try not to get freaked out by kind of number one isms, whether in the economic sphere or the military sphere. It's really about taking care of the United States and its allies and defending the values that we instilled in the international orders built around individual human rights.
I think it's really important too, just to add on to that, as something else we need to be cautious about is, we've talked a lot about what didn't happen, what's not consistent with the Cold War period. One thing we did really well with the Soviets was to have a very strongly national interest-based foreign policy, as John suggested. Increasingly, I think our domestic political challenges are creeping in and shaping elements of our foreign policy. I mean, I think the best example really for the current administration is that, at least to my understanding, there's nothing that looks like a discernible trade strategy from this administration, and especially in a region like East Asia, right, where economics is security. It matters a great deal to them. If we don't have anything to bring to the table, it's sort of game over for us in the region. And, you know, we all know that the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, is not great from a standards point of view. It's certainly not the Trans-Pacific Partnership that we walked away from, but it's something. And China has a very important trade agreement with Europe on the table. We'll see if it can survive the current tensions between Europe and China. But my point is, they're moving out smartly on this line, and we've got nothing, and that's really troublesome.
Let me ask you guys one more question, and then we'll go to audience Q&A. And it's a tough question, and I want you to look out. And I'd like to know what you think is the difference between where we in Beijing successfully manage this relationship, right? What does that world look like versus the world where we don't manage it well?
Okay, well, like ceteris paribus, assuming things continue as they are, the Communist Party is still in power, we're still a democracy and a republic, you know, we'll set the high standards. I think we're going to have to kind of work through the trajectory we had to do with the Soviet Union, and it may actually only come with clarity after a crisis, because one of the things we're lacking right now is robust crisis management capability in either capital. But I think that China will be a very important country in the world that will have found where it can't touch the third rails, that generate not only a hostile US response, but a hostile global and international response. And that the US is kind of continues to do what I think we started to do in the last few months, which is rebuild our alliances and recover the trust that we need. You know, we could not have won the Cold War without NATO or without the other alliances across the world. And reintegrate ourselves into a better trading and international order that addresses our legitimate concerns about employment and about manufacturing. And so that's going to be a discussion, I think, that can really only be had with China included. And so once we get past this kind of arraying for rivalry, I think we can get down to the hard business of building this future where we can avoid these existential kind of threats that we both acknowledge.
Chris?
Yeah, just quickly, I mean, to add to John's point, I think one thing that's encouraging, to give the administration some kudos as well, you know, we're seeing that there's a very active effort to reach out to China to work on these confidence building measures and, you know, crisis management capabilities. General Austin is going to the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, and his Chinese counterpart will be there. And we saw the NSC Asia czar Kurt Campbell in an interview with the Guardian newspaper sort of suggest, you know, our current phone system doesn't seem to work very well. We need something that works a little better. So I'm pleased to see them doing that, because it shows, to John's point, that they realize how important that is. To kind of try to answer your straight question as directly as I can, I think in a world where it works out well, the rivalry is there, but it can be managed, and that we do find some areas to cooperate on. And I think a lot of that, to get there, one thing I really worry about, to John's point about the Chinese and their sort of dialectical mindset, if the Biden administration continues down what seems to be its current path in two major areas, one is, you know, the continuing pressure on human rights and things like that. That makes a lot of sense to some degree. But more importantly, the technology war, the trade war aspects, what they're doing is validating that assessment that, okay, so we've had a change of administration and the policy is the same. So this means that from our dialectical perspective, the inevitable war between socialism and capitalism, it's on, it's arrived, maybe earlier than we would have liked, but it is here now. And that is going to cause them, I think, to do some very disruptive things. If we don't get it right, that's a, you know, in a good scenario, if we manage to find a way to understand some of this. If we don't get it right, I think it's a war. You know, I don't know what it looks like and over what and so on, but you know, we need desperately some steam off-gassing valves in this relationship pretty darn quickly, in my opinion.
Okay, let's go to questions. That's very, very concerning, to say the least. Let's go to questions. there's a couple questions about the relationship between China and Russia, and how to think about that relationship, particularly as it relates to the United States. Who wants to grab that one?
I'll kick off there. It's funny, John and I were just talking about this earlier today when we were talking about what we might talk about today. I think it's very interesting when you look over the last several years at Russia, China. To my mind, it's one of the areas that even the Trump administration, which seemed to be concerned about everything that related to China, they were concerned about it, but I think largely from a wrong perspective, which was this, they're out to poison our precious bodily fluids together, sort of mindset. I think what we're seeing is a relationship where these two very important countries see tremendous opportunity from what they perceive to be U.S. decline. And they see tremendous opportunity to work together and to make independent achievements. I think we have to break out a little bit the different approaches or capabilities, maybe is a better word, of the two powers. Russia sees it as an opportunity to continue to, survive by making a mess. I think that's the best I can put it as a non-Russia expert. China sees it as an opportunity to build its, great power strength and kind of ride from victory to victory, if you will. It's very clear to me that the two leaderships have a very close relationship. I mean, it's a bit bizarre, right? They celebrate birthdays together. They have cake and ice cream. They call each other their closest friend. And I think when they look at each other, they see the other guy, right? So when Xi Jinping looks at Putin, he sees a guy who will do anything to maintain his system, just like Xi Jinping will. He sees somebody who will go to the mattresses for that system, just like Xi Jinping will. And he sees a leader who is strong and, in charge of his system, just like Xi Jinping is. What's interesting, I think, is that when you get below that leadership level in both governments, then the mutual suspicions are a little harder to ignore. But I think what we miss sometimes in all the hullabaloo about US-China relations, every time I look, either in statements or in actions, the Russians and the Chinese are doing something they either have never done before together or are doing with more intensity. And I think that's really problematic.
Yeah. This is a really important question. So there's been, John, as you know, there's been productive track 2 discussions with China on arms control and strategic stability, but not much discussion, if any, between the two governments. How concerning is that to you? How do we get the Chinese to come to the table to talk about arms control? Just some thoughts around that.
Well, their excuse for, my entire career and yours was that the disparity between US and Russian superiority was so great that there was nothing for China to talk about, that they had a small, minimally deterrent nuclear force. Well, that's changing. In the annual DoD report to Congress that Department of Defense publishes every year, they assessed that China had, its ICBMs that can target the United States since roughly 2000 had gone from 18 to about 200 or 170, and they were building out toward 400 nuclear warheads by 2030. So that's the most, ambitious growth in Chinese nuclear capabilities in the history of the PRC. And one could look at it with a wonky hat on and conclude it's still about minimal deterrence because they have to build a force that can deter US nuclear attack while taking into account US missile defenses and overall superiority. But they're reaching a threshold. And I think that idea that nuclear security has to be linked to conventional security, and that the US and China, even more than Russia really, are very near peers, that whatever advantages the US has by having 1,500 nuclear warheads on ICBMs versus China's hundreds, is something that will only worsen with time as those ratios, change, or could lead to, what we experienced in the bad parts of the Cold War, which was wholesale nuclear building at a scale that, was really unstable. So I think that logic is there, but we haven't been able to get the Chinese to engage. And in the past, it used to be because of the resistance of their nuclear forces. I'm wondering if under this new, more Xi-centric military, their post-Goldwater-Nichols kind of reorg, that you might find that you can have a political discussion on that as opposed to kind of the military level discussion that we were pursuing, in the 2000s.
I'm going to put a lot of questions together here. There's a lot of questions about the importance of US diplomacy in the world and our relationships with our allies, which I think you guys have answered. Absolutely critical, I think is what you would say. But there's a kind of a flip side to that question, and that is the Chinese have sort of stumbled, right, in exercising soft power. And the question is, won't they learn from those stumbles? Won't they get better at this themselves over time? And won't our advantage vis-a-vis, right, relationships with allies erode over time as they do that? How do you guys think about that?
I mean, I think all those statements are true. I guess a couple of points I would make. One, they do seem to have stumbled here and there. Again, from our perspective, I learned early on in watching this place that when they do something that seems to be, let's say, not in their own interest, or perhaps shooting themselves in the face, I found it was useful to ask myself a couple of questions. The first was, what do they know, or what, perhaps better, what do they assess? Because sometimes this is where their dialectical mindset lets them down, that I do not, that makes them think this is a good idea. I think that we need to be humble in analyzing it that way. The second, as John alluded to earlier, is, are they getting to a position where they believe their own propaganda and rhetoric and nonsense sufficiently that they think that they can just act with impunity? And obviously that's a much more dangerous place. I would single out, for example, the case of the economic pressure campaign against Australia. I think this is a very good microcosm of this issue. To all of us, we look at that and we say, what are they doing? They're unifying the West. They're taking a country that actually wants to have a pretty balanced relationship with them and making them pretty much a sworn enemy, and so on. But if you're China, and let's say your strategy in part with that campaign is, yeah, I lose a lot of international good guy points and reputational points, but if I can hobble the effort to build a coalition of the willing to work against me in a sort of containment style program, that's a good thing. And when we see what happened when the so-called Quad countries of Japan, Australia, the US, and India had their leaders summit earlier this year, the leaders wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post, and strangely enough, the C word, China, was nowhere to be mentioned. I think it's our understanding that the Australians and the Indians were very reticent. So I think that speaks to your question about the allies. The other thing is on the learnings point. Yeah, I think so. I think in the past, they demonstrated a capability to learn quickly and adapt. I think this issue of the buying into one's own narrative makes me question whether they're as adept at that as they used to be.
John, a question about Chinese military bases overseas, right? One in Djibouti. There's discussions of possibly others. How do the Chinese think about those? How concerned should we be about them?
Well, I don't think they're really about power projection, because even if you have a force in Djibouti that can support a couple hundred troops, it's really about protecting Chinese interest in Africa, in the Indian Ocean, and globally, rather than projecting power. Because when you're that far from your home base, with no, robust means of support, not even the base they have in Djibouti is nothing like, say, the U.S. base at Yokosuka, right? It's a presence. It's a place to berth ships and bed down troops, but it's not a basis for power projection. So one thing I noticed that if you go back and look at what U.S. was saying in like annual DNI and DCIA threat briefings 10 years ago, by 2020, we thought they'd have 3 or 4 bases in the Indian Ocean, Southeast Asia, and even on the Atlantic coast of Africa. And so it's interesting, as I noted earlier, not only what they've done, but what they've failed to do. So that tells me that this issue of basing is more fraught in terms of developing the kind of political relationships they'd need, even in a place like Cambodia, where there was, hot reporting that they were all set to go at Siem Reap, 2 years ago. And yet, as far as I know, there may be some construction, but it's not at all clear that there's a PLA footprint or that there's going to be. And so I think that's an area where actually the US still and its allies still have a lot of sway, that, Africa the African countries have a lot of agency, and if the U.S. invests time and interest in African development, and seeing it as a place not just to combat terrorism or extract resources, that you'll find the Africans are very good and have 200 years of playing the great powers off against each other. And China is by no means the only actor in Africa, nor of course is the U.S. And so I think that the community can maybe take a breath here about the dire threat of Chinese bases as locus of power projection. I think they're really more the accoutrements of a great power, especially a country with global trading.
A question about oil in 1941 and semiconductors, right, in 2021. To what extent do you see a parallel? And maybe sharpen the question a little bit. To what degree is the U.S. taking a risk by denying advanced semiconductors to China?
I'm going to let John answer the history part because he's a better historian than I am.
Yeah, I've heard that, first data was the new oil, and then I heard there was something else was the new oil, maybe cryptocurrency. I think oil is still the oil in the form of, broader as energy, and China clearly operates at the end of a very long pipeline. And I think it's a different problem set in terms of dependence on outside sources for advanced semiconductors, which the Chinese, has been all over the press for 10 years. The Chinese saw as a threat, where 90% of their semiconductors were imported mostly from the United States. And so they attempted to move up that value chain, and they invested tens of billions. And they did shrink their process, but they managed to stay still 3 generations behind because the industry itself just keeps moving forward. So now, with the case of Taiwan Semiconductor Corporation or Manufacturing Corporation, you have kind of a new problem where you can, merge then this tech dependence on external sources with the Taiwan issue to create, this little silicon perfect storm right off the Chinese coast, where you've got not only China dependent on TSMC for the advanced chips that will feed handheld devices and all of the things that are going to be hinged into 5G technology, but the US is now dependent, where Taiwan has actually leapt out ahead in terms of manufacturing process shrinks, even ahead of Intel and US corporations. So then it's kind of pushed the fact that TSMC is a Taiwan company 100 miles off China's coast into becoming a national security issue for the United States. So I don't know how analogous that is to oil. Maybe I feel I can't see the parallels, but I think it's its own unique kind of problem that we're all going to have to wrestle with, because Taiwan knows that if they become part of a really smothering tech denial strategy of the United States, that it also then creates security problems for Taiwan.
Right.
Let me try to answer your question, Michael, because I think it's an important one about are we making a mistake by cutting them off the way we have? I'll do so by sharing an anecdote from a discussion I had with a senior member of the Trump administration at the time the Huawei ban was put in place. The first question I had, very neutrally, was, "What are you guys trying to do? Are you trying to kill the company? Are you trying to set it as an example, and so on?" And the answer was sort of, well, we're not trying to kill the company, but we are trying to kneecap it, which I thought was quite mafioso style. But the second question I asked was, okay, let's say you're successful in that and you slow Huawei down by 5 years, or maybe you break them entirely. But if as a consequence of that, the Chinese go all in on quantum computing, AI, biopharma, biotech, name your poison, and get there, quote unquote, in controlling some of these so-called platforms of the 21st century knowledge economy, was it worth it? And I think that's a fundamental question that's not been answered.
Yeah. Question, Chris, for you, right up your alley, is corruption in China. Kind of the status of it, level of it. Is it a threat to political stability? Is it a political tool? Is it all of those things? How do you think about corruption in China?
Yeah, well, it's all of the above. I like to call it Xi Jinping's multi-layered cake of motivation when it comes to corruption and the corruption campaign. It's all of those things. It's definitely a political tool. Strangely enough, no one close to Xi Jinping has been, brought down really in the anti-corruption campaign. There have been a few minor cases that did have some touch to him, but for the most part, it's been his political rivals. But that's at the so-called tigers level, as they put it, the senior most officials, many of whom were already retired, the ones he chose to go after because that was the best he could do, although he did topple a couple of sitting Politburo members. Then there's the issue of the so-called flies, which is the lower level officials. And that's where they have a problem with the Chinese populace. That's very serious. That's not political. It's about, this is the face of the regime to our, the folks in the villages, the folks at the local level, and they don't like the face. They're being shaken down for every type of fee under the sun, the police shakedown and so on. So that's a big part of the anti-corruption campaign too. I think it is obviously a very serious thing. I would argue it's much less of a challenge than it was. These days, everyone, I think there's a general consensus, Xi Jinping can't do anything good. He's just a bad guy and we shouldn't like him. Well, the reality is that, and this comes back to the point we were talking about earlier about how the other members of the leadership feel, Xi and a lot of others actually thought the most dangerous place for the Chinese Communist Party was what was happening before he showed up. And that's symbolized in the fall of Bo Xilai, a very senior party official whose wife thought it was a good idea to poison and kill a foreigner. Et cetera. They thought the hinges were coming off the system because of the corruption, and therefore, what they've done to try to mitigate that has been successful, I think, in stabilizing their hold on power. That said, it's a very intractable problem. I mean, even now we get reports when people are arrested that people had, in some cases, $500, or $50 million in various currencies and gold, in a subterranean level in their house, and they're sort of like a sub-provincial official. I mean, it's ridiculous the amount of money and therefore opportunity for corruption that's circulating around in China.
Yeah, let me just ask one more question, which I think is a good one. The Chinese obviously benefited significantly, right, from the world order of the last 50 years. Do they realize that? How do they think about the role that the US played in that global order? And how do they think about the decline of the US, right, in terms of the maintenance of that order and how much they benefited from it? Are they willing to step into the breach, right?
Yeah.
So to speak. Just comments from both of you, and then we'll close here.
Let me give a quick answer and then let John give a better one. My thought is that they definitely know they benefited. They say so publicly, on a regular basis. So there's no question. I don't think that they felt they benefited. I think they feel that the role of the U.S. in that process was largely benign. I mean, they don't talk about this publicly, but I think at the leadership level there is a general assessment of that. Even though they have to grit their teeth sometimes, I think they definitely feel, for example, the U.S. was instrumental in, from their perspective, tamping down or preventing a resurgence of what they consider to be Japanese militarism, a series of other things that, for reasons of history, fundamentally unnerved them. What do they think about U.S. decline? I think, as we mentioned earlier, it's an opportunity for them. My sense, John may have a different view. I don't buy into the theory that they have an alternative idea in mind to replace what we would collectively call that rules-based international system. I think it's actually far more dangerous than that, which is that they want to break what's there now, or at least ensure that what is there now is modified to be, quote unquote, making it safe for the Chinese Communist Party. But I don't think they have an alternative in mind. So if they do enough damage to the existing system, but are unwilling, as you say, to step into that leadership role, it could make for a very messy situation, as John said at the top of our discussion.
John?
Yeah, I mean, to build on what Chris said, remember, right after the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union, Deng Xiaoping enunciated this strategy of Taoguang Yanghui, which was hide your strength, bide your time, and parenthetically, don't become the target for the hegemon. So the Chinese put a premium, and I think they actually still put a premium on trying to maintain stable US-China relations. Now, they always had red lines where, they would be willing to take the gloves off if certain lines were crossed, mostly about territory in Taiwan and the legitimacy of the Communist Party. but they managed to work within that system and use it to drive and enhance Communist Party legitimacy through economic performance, decade over decade. So I already, early on this chat, I talked about kind of the 10 years ago problem after the global financial crisis. But even today, the Chinese would like to return to a more manageable and predictable US relationship. It's one of the things, in a way, they probably think it's a strategy that we're withholding that, because in a way, an unpredictable relationship with the United States is a real problem for them. It means that they don't know kind of how to prepare for some future moves. And that gives us some leverage. If we can, rebuild alliances and then bring a coherent kind of strategy in order to address that, they don't want to take on our burdens. They've seen, what happens when you become the security guarantor of multiple regions around the world. They have no appetite to replace us in Afghanistan, or to try and build a separate alliance network. And they still think alliances are, not in their interest. So I think, again, as we move forward, and because this will be a decades-long process, it's really a systems kind of challenge for the United States and China. But yeah, to also pick up on what Chris said, in terms of the international orders, the Chinese don't want to overturn them. They benefited from them arguably more than any country over the last 40 years, but they want them to legitimatize China's system. They feel that the international order and is biased in favor of democracies and human rights. And you can see through their activism in the United Nations and their activism in a lot of the more impoverished parts of the world that, they get traction by kind of harping on the need to protect development interests and give those kind of values, equality, along with democracy and human rights. And I think that's turf we have to defend. I think that is our fundamental brand. It's what being American means.
This is why I think it's so important that we get the global ambitions rack and stack for China correct in building our strategy. If you really strip it away, obviously my sense is they do want to be the hegemon, certainly in their own region, or at least to have other countries think about what China might think about what they're thinking about doing just as quickly as they do the US. But I think if you look at the fundamentals, what they really want now is to be treated as an equal. And as I mentioned earlier in the discussion, we don't always do that, especially with this idea of, we get to control how this relationship is framed and how it's conducted. We need to have some learnings on that, I think, if we're going to get it right.
Thank you both very much. There were many, many questions we didn't get to. We could have gone on for a very long time, but my thanks to both of you for joining us. Larry?
Pleasure.
Well, hey, thanks. That was wonderful. Very rich conversation. Reminded me, and I'm sure Michael as well, about some of the sessions we'd have in the director's office or the director's conference room where you guys would make us smart before we have to march off to meetings to put the policymakers at least within some kind of boundary of reality. So thank you very much for that. Lots of nuance that you guys presented, much more nuance tonight than a lot of our audience members are going to see on, cable television. So thank you very much for that. Michael, as always, you did a fantastic job steering the conversation. Audience members, you sent in fantastic questions. As always, we'd love to get to them all, but the old showbiz adage, we want you coming back. So hopefully you'll come back next week when we meet with those great former Intel leaders and talk about the future of intelligence writ large. General Hayden, any final comment?
It was a wonderful evening. Thank you again. Thank you again.
Thank you, Larry, and thank you, Michael Hayden. Thank you to both John and Chris and Michael Morell moderating the event. And we have another great one coming up next week. So to all who came tonight, thank you for attending. Check out the Schar School of Policy and Government Twitter feed. We highlight all the events of the Schar School, including those of various centers, including the Hayden Center, so you can see what various programs we're putting on in a variety of policy arenas. And I hope to see many of you back here next week for the next event of the Hayden Center. Good night, everybody.